Thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. I'm really glad that we have two people who have, been on the ground working through a lot of these issues in reality. So thanks to both of you for joining us. So I wanted to start off with sort of a high-level question, just given, we are in DC. We've had several members of Congress here. And there's been, a lot of rhetoric from both sides of the aisle about business, particularly big business, and whether they are a friend or foe on various issues. The Biden administration, I think, also has had a bit of a mixed record when it comes to working with businesses. So I wanted to ask both of you, how does that color or affect the ability to have effective public and private partnerships? Does that matter, the rhetoric, once you're sort of dealing with hard issues?
I'll start. Politics is politics, and I think people are going to say things. I'll say from our perspective, we have not had a problem picking up the phone and talking to whoever we need to talk to, and whether that be on railroad issues, which was a really big deal for us. I probably was talking to the administration almost every single day, whether it be on issues at the port. Early on reached out to them to say we wanted to sort of help and work on the solutions for the supply chain. And our phone calls were returned and we had really constructive dialogue. There's going to be noise in the background. That's this town. You got to push through it, no matter who's in the White House.
Yeah,
and I agree with that. But let me take your political question in a slightly different direction, because, we're here to talk about supply chain problems writ large. And one of my frustrations is that I think politics has actually prevented us from looking at the right solutions when it comes to supply chains. And the one area where I would be critical of this administration, where they haven't engaged, really is on trade agreements. If you want to solve supply chain problems, you need to be engaging with friends, allies, partners around the world and looking at ways to reduce barriers to goods and services moving between us. And so there's been some rhetoric about friendshoring, but when it comes to the policy itself, we haven't seen any of that in practice. And I think politics is a big reason for that. And there's been some concern about taking on certain groups who have been opposed to trade agreements in the past.
So, Clee, following up on that, you are recently wrote something on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Trump administration had pulled out of. And, frankly, Democrats have also not been a fan of as well. So how do you see the path forward for something like that, given the political headwinds?
Well, first of all, the report I put out this week, it's called Reimagining the TPP. It was something I did on a bipartisan basis with Wendy Cutler, who had a high-ranking position in the Obama administration. And really the whole idea was this. We wanted to prove that you could have a real conversation about TPP. We're tired of this binary yes or no. Let's actually talk about the substance. Are there problems, and how do we address them? Because my perspective, and I think Wendy's as well, is that right now, if you look around the region, you have other countries like China going around, engaging in all these trade agreements. We're on the sidelines. We're not offering real solutions. So the question is there a way to take a real trade agreement model, go beyond IPEF, which doesn't include market access provisions, and is there a way to make that viable politically in the United States? And my view is that it is. And we had broad consultations with folks on the Hill, with folks, on the right and on the left. And the theory that we really have here is let's do to TPP what we did to NAFTA. Let's take an agreement that was unpopular. Let's make some fixes to it. And I think if we do that, we can get bipartisan support. And I think that's what we need to solve some of our supply chain problems, as well as to get us in the game vis-a-vis China and others in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, let me jump in on that. I mean, it was funny when trade became a four-letter word, and it really was around TPP. And it was sort of mind-blowing, especially those whose lives, sort of careers are built around trade. We got to step back into it. We really do. There's been an absence of conversation on it. You had a really successful passage of USMCA. People came together. It was bipartisan. Why we can't do that right away with the United Kingdom, with Europe, and with Asia? It just has to get done, and we got to move forward quickly.
Well, and I do want to move on from trade agreements, but in terms of how you sell it, because that seems to be one of the main problems in terms of getting political buy-in. I was at the Democratic National Convention when Hillary was nominated, and a lot of Bernie supporters, they had all these signs with like TPP with a circle and a line against it. But then when you would ask them why they were against it, they kind of didn't know. They just it just became a slogan. But how do you, have a catchy slogan for, TPP in terms of
I don't have a singular slogan, but I'll give you three. I'll give you three concise reasons. Number one, China. The world has changed. They are aggressive and assertive in the Indo-Pacific. We are on the sidelines. And it's easier for companies right now because of the existing TPP and the RCEP to link supply chains with China than it is with the United States. That's unacceptable. Number two, you have this scenario where we have USMCA. We showed we could do this in a bipartisan way, that we could raise labor standards, we could raise environmental standards, we could fix rules of origin on autos. And I think you can incorporate that kind of stuff into these agreements. And I would say to those environmentalists, union folks, if you really want countries around the world to level the playing field, you actually have to have true trade agreements with incentives for them to do that. And that's what we can do through these agreements. And then the third point is really just the export opportunities for businesses, agriculture, energy. We make stuff in the United States. We need to sell it abroad. And so I think you can sell it on all three of those terms.
Great. Well, maybe they should hire you.
Yeah.
Marketing person. Mike, in terms of lessons learned from the pandemic, just talking to folks from the White House, I thought it was interesting hearing from them just about how much certain companies actually didn't know about their supply chains when these disruptions hit. Like automakers knew about sort of their first tier suppliers, but not sort of their second tier, third tier. And that helped cause more challenges in terms of getting around those bottlenecks. What are the lessons learned, and what do you think still needs to be done to ease some of these issues?
I've had a lot of conversations on supply chain, from the start of COVID. And I think a lot of folks just got used to hitting the order button, right? The old internet button, and all of a sudden your supplies showed up, and whether that be masks early on or whether that be pharmaceutical products. And they didn't understand where it was coming from, how it was getting there, how long it was going to take to produce, what materials were needed, and the complexities of really what a global supply chain is right now. So to me, the most important thing is data, right? And the more data that we have from the front end of the manufacturing process to the final mile of delivery and everything in between is what's going to make us better. 6-7 years ago, we experienced it as a company, and we thought we were great on data. And we had surges, we had bad weather, and all of a sudden, we weren't good anymore for 30 days in December about 7 years ago. And we said, we got to get better. We need to understand what our customers are doing, how much volume our customers are going to give us. And that is a daily task that we have to do, particularly at this time of year. And when you have that data, you can manage your resources, you can manage your assets, you can manage your people, and you can get your final mile deliveries done on time. And that really is the number one metric for us as a company.
Yeah. And I'm relying on you to get my daughter's Christmas presents on time. Cleet, I wanted to ask you, and Mike as well, there seems to be, whenever there's a crisis, like the threat of the rail strike or the pandemic, there's always this rush for the public and private sectors to come together. But when there's not a crisis, what are the mechanisms do you see to have more consistent, regular interaction with the private sector so that you're not scrambling to who do I call for this? Or, the ports are backed up. How do we get, the cargo from here to there?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, I think now is the time when we need to be preparing for the next crisis situation, the next pandemic, the next supply chain crisis. And we really need to put rules in place that govern it so we don't end up exacerbating the problem once it hits. And I do agree that some of that is, as Mike was saying, some of this is information and data and making sure we clearly understand where the choke points really are on the supply chains and what are the mechanisms we can put together, working together, public and private. I'd also look at, are there rules about the things we do when there's a crisis? And one of the things we saw with COVID is a bunch of countries putting in export restraints on the critical supplies, and that exacerbated the supply chain crisis. And then I think there are things we can do domestically to make sure that we do have, we shouldn't onshore everything, but we can create incentives to make sure that in the most important supply chains, we either can do this in the United States, we can do it with allies who aren't going to put barriers in place. And I would go back to sort of what I was talking about earlier on sort of how trade agreements play a role as well.
Yeah, listen, I'll start with the trade agreements as well. And I think setting the rules for trade so that they're easy to understand, some of that complexity is out of there. I think particularly on the small and medium-sized business side, larger businesses are pretty sophisticated and are able to figure it out and have the resources. But we do need to make it easier for entrepreneurs, for the small and mid-sized company to interact in international trade, because there's great potential there. And then all these supply chain task force that are out there, we got to keep them going, right? They can't be a one-hit wonder. They have to be real. You know, the power of the federal government in a lot of ways is the ability to convene. You know, when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to the private sector, there isn't, you know, a ton of rules that potentially can be placed on them unless some new laws are passed. But they do have tremendous power to bring people together, to hold people accountable. And when the supply chains aren't working like they should, or folks are falling behind, there's a lot of pressure that they can put on them to improve the service across all facets of supply
it
chain.
seemed like the ports are, John Picari and other, that seemed like it worked out actually really well.
I thought he was great. I remember sending him a letter saying I wanted to have a conversation, and within 24 hours we were on the phone and we were working together, trying to understand our role that we played with ocean shipping, how we move product for our customers off the ships into warehouses and then to final destinations. And he wanted to learn. He was engaged. He was fantastic.
Great. I think we're almost out of time. I think we have time for one audience question, if anyone has anything.
Well, nobody else does.
Sure.
We're on camera, so go ahead, Matt. Clete, I've read some things that you and Wendy put together about trying to do the TPP. Now, in the when I was on the Senate Banking Committee staff and we saw NAFTA, we saw the ADST provision for the first time. As you know, when Lighthizer redid NAFTA, he took ADST out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to take ADST out of your TPP proposal that you and Wendy are putting together?
Yeah, and you mean
ADST.
Alternative.
Yeah.
ADST is a system where it incentivizes our companies to be able to invest in the other country, therefore offshoring jobs from the United States.
It's investor
As you know,
state.
we run about. Last year we had $1 trillion
I can answer quickly.
trade deficit in manufactured goods. That's why trade has a bad name in this country.
So we've tried to learn from what was done in USMCA, and I actually think that what we're trying to do is a flexible, bifurcated approach. For countries like Canada in USMCA, there wasn't the ability to bring investor-state disputes. There were some concerns about that. But for Mexico, as we're seeing in real time, there are things going on in their energy sector that we do need to be able to challenge. So what we're recommending in our report is a similar approach where maybe with Singapore, Australia, Canada, we don't need investor state, but with Malaysia, Vietnam, we would include it. And the idea would be to focus on sectors and countries where there's a problem, which we need for our private sector, but not to allow private sector to challenge the government on their right to regulate more generally.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.